My name is Warwick, Lightfoot. I'm the Head of Economics and Social Policy at Policy Exchange. And this afternoon's discussion panel, Time to Disrupt an Industrial Strategy for the Digital Economy, really speaks to some of the big questions that increasingly we're waking up to, that you can have a changing technology that just transforms the way you go about doing things. Now, the first time people started thinking about this is about the 1990s. And the point that's actually made was it's not about something new that's nice or helpful to have. For example, cars were nice to have in 1895, but they didn't go very well. They were very expensive, and they weren't in any way disruptive. Most people carried on using horses, and we were reliant on trains and horsepower. It wasn't until the evolution of that technology to the Model T transformed transport, and you saw a truly disruptive technology. And the whole purpose of this afternoon's discussion is to ask, what role does that have in improving productivity? What implications does it have for employment? What are the likely industries that are going to be disrupted? We have an excellent panel to help us navigate our way through it. The Right Honourable Matt Hancock, the Minister for Digital, is sitting next to me, and he very kindly has taken on the sort of hard-lifting job on the panel of sort of setting out the framework of the discussion for us this afternoon. Our sponsors are represented by its Chief Digital Officer from Aviva, Andrew Brem. Aviva is very interesting. Policy Exchange have worked a lot with Aviva over the years, and they have developed a series of tech hubs that really are transforming the way we actually approach digital within the economy. And what I think he's going to explain to you is, we know Aviva as an insurance company that helps us when something's gone wrong, when we've had a flood or the house is burnt down or we've had a crash. A large part of what they're trying to do is develop technologies that protect us as consumers from something going wrong in the house to start with, when perhaps there's already damp from a fridge or from a water pipe that's leaking in advance. Romilly Dennys, the director of Coadec, is someone carefully involved in the analysis of the digital economy, and she's going to talk to us about the role in digital change and productivity, and she's taken a very keen interest in all of that. And Alistair Cohen, who's the Chief Executive of OnCare, based just off High Street, Kensington, in London, is developing care solutions by using the whole range of digital options that are available. And I think the last time we were on a panel together, we talked about some of the limitations of using digital in relation to social care. But maybe, since we last spoke, and I learned a little bit more about Japan, it may turn out that there's going to be more use made of digital and robotics in relation to care, in perhaps ways that some of us like me hadn't really thought of before. But I'm going to ask Matt to lead us off and set the sort of framework for us.
Well, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Great classic, cracking Policy Exchange discussion, I hope, ahead of us with standing room only, which is what we've come to expect from one of Westminster's best think tanks. So it's a real pleasure. And we are talking about the topic that is the single most important topic in terms of changing the country that we live in. It's the only thing that's bigger than Brexit. It's the technological revolution. And ultimately, what's happening, what we're living through over this generation, is driven by a change in the cost of storing data, storing information, and transmitting that information. And this fall in the cost is bigger than at any time since the printing press was invented. And if you think about it, when the printing press was invented, the cost of transmitting information went from the cost of hiring your monk for the day to write into a book to the cost of the printed page, and it was a dramatic fall, and it led to information being more widely available, the democratization of knowledge, ultimately the fall of the established church, the end of the feudal system. It brought massive economic and social consequences. And this time around, over the last generation, the cost of transmitting information and storing data has fallen from the cost of the printed document to the infinitesimally small cost of digital storage and of of sending information, which is in the short run 0 and in the long run extremely low. And it is having profound implications on a similar scale to the first time round in terms of disrupting every part of our economy and large parts of our society and how we deal with these things. And so my thesis is that we have to understand the change, and we have to be ahead of the change, but we need to bring society with us on that change. One way of thinking about this is that I tend these days to write my notes for speeches like this on my phone, which I put in front of me. But it looks socially and culturally, it looks rude as I type into my phone, because you think that I'm texting my wife. But actually, if I were to write notes, I would look diligent, and you look extremely diligent.
I'm trying to look diligent for you,
and that's a tiny, tiny example of the sorts of cultural changes that we're having to get used to and internalise. Now, one of the biggest areas of challenge is what is the impact on jobs, and I just want to dwell on that for a moment, because throughout history, again, productivity has led to the displacement of jobs. One person's productivity revolution is another person's job loss. And we've just come from an excellent speech by Philip Hammond setting out why we need the free market economy. And he talked a lot about productivity. But if you make things more productive, then you don't need as many people. And over the last 100 years, measured productivity in the UK has gone up about tenfold, but we don't have 90% fewer jobs than them, because we human beings are ingenious, I mean as a collective, not me personally, at using technology and then spending our time doing other things. And so our goal has got to be that we create the new jobs that come up. I've used this phrase, we need to humanise the work and automate the work and humanise the jobs. We need to automate the work so that all the hard, dangerous, boring stuff we automate, and humanise the jobs, because jobs will be increasingly about the tacit capabilities that only human beings can have. And then there are those who argue that this disruption is going to lead to none of us having anything to do in the future. Now, this is an argument that's been run over the generations. Keynes wrote about technological unemployment. Harold Wilson, before he got onto the white heat of technology, when he was in opposition, argued that technology would take all the jobs away. It's well known, and every time in history that this argument's been run, it's been wrong. Because ultimately, the risk to jobs is not the adoption of technology. The risk to jobs is failing to adopt new technology. So we've got to be on the side of the creators, of the innovators, of the businesses who are creating these jobs. And if we try to stop job losses by sticking our heads in the sand, then we will simply fail to get the new jobs that are available in designing and running this amazing revolution. And this is ultimately quite political, because we've had Uber banned in London. We heard last week that Jeremy Corbyn wants to tax robots. I think that is directly the opposite approach to what we need, right? Because taxing robots is a tax on innovation. It's a tax on the future. We know that he doesn't much like robots, mindless automatons, enslaved to the will of their master, incapable of independent thought, incapable of joy or happiness or love, just like the moderate wing of the Labour Party. And so we have to make sure that we are on the side of the future, that we embrace it, we make sure our regulations change so that they support and allow for innovation, that the way that we attract industries, that we attract the experts. I'm very much a fan of experts. We attract the brightest and the best from around the world, and we make the UK the place that the technology, the standards that surround it, the ethical frameworks that are needed, the rules and the norms, whether that's legislative or social, are developed so that we can be the leaders and take on this new technology. And I am an absolute optimist and enthusiast that we can do this. But I'm also clear, having thought very hard about the consequences for people and for employment, that if we don't do this, then the future will be much, much more bleak than if we do this. And yes, there are challenges in getting from A to B, and it is not easy to retrain people and to make sure people have got the skills to succeed in this new world that we're building. But we absolutely must ensure that we get redeployment, not unemployment, because if instead we stick our heads in the sand, then we will go backwards. The innovation will continue, but it will be driven from elsewhere. We will get all the downsides, but we won't get the upsides that are possible from these amazing new technologies.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. That really does sort of set the picture for us very neatly as our exam questions for this afternoon. I think it would be helpful if our sponsors Aviva, if Andrew could just tell us about the interesting work that you're doing and how you see this a whole journey. And of course, I suppose at some level, digital technology, information and big data and all the rest of it, there's no sector that's more likely to be disrupted than insurance.
Absolutely. I have to say it's taken a while. I mean, we're a 321-year-old insurance company, so we were around before cars existed. But disruption is very much on our doorstep right now. A couple of thoughts on it. First of all, the implications for financial services are absolutely enormous. And it starts with the consumer. So, for the last 15 and 20 years, we've been merrily doing our grocery shopping online or flirting on Facebook or booking our airline tickets. It's actually much, much more recently than that technological changes really hit consumers in financial services. But it's not just the trivial stuff. It's actually quite fundamental things. So you may think of insurance as being insuring your car, insuring your home, but actually a huge part of our business is pensions, savings and investments. And this is an area of absolutely societally, sort of deep societal importance. And one of the things we see digital as doing for our consumers is to help them make smart choices. So yeah, there's all the obvious stuff about price transparency that comes very naturally with the digital economy, and the ability to shop around very easily, or the ability to have access to information for everyone who can access a computer of sorts. But actually, where I think we have some of the most interesting opportunities would be almost educational. So the choices that consumers have to make about saving for their future are things that consumers find quite tricky to understand. And in fact, we know, as a matter of fact, people are making suboptimal decisions. So one of the things that we do is to use excellent design, use apps, use digital technology to nudge people into taking their head out of the sand, confronting the future with confidence and making smarter decisions, for example, about their pensions. And a very practical example of that is we have online a little tool, a little sort of mini app, a savings profiler that asks you a few questions, some of them vaguely financial, some of them more behavioural, a bit like a kind of Myers-Briggs test, and it gives you a superhero profile. Absurd, you may say, that's just making a joke out of something deeply, deeply important, but actually not at all. It allows people to confront both their vulnerabilities as well as their skills in the area of savings. And what we've seen is consumers actually then go on and talk to their employers and make smarter choice about the future. There are also other areas, such as the ones that you mentioned, such as the switch from insurance as something to make good when things go wrong, to insurance as something to prevent things going wrong. So just an example, we've invested in a company called Cocoon. Cocoon is a little kind of video camera that also listens to your home using sub-sound technology. It uses that to learn your behaviours and warn you when it notices something strange. And obviously that then might prevent a burglary. We have similar things for leak detection. And so there's a whole move in our industry to move from protection to prevention. And these are kind of quite profound. In fact, the way we look at it is actually ask it never. I'm sure you've all bought insurance or tried to at one point and will wonder why you were hauled through the absurd litany of questions. Is your house, is it thatched, or do you live in a kind of chalet bungalow, whatever on earth that is? That is unnecessary in the world of Google Street View, when we should damn well know what house you live in. By making that experience utterly friction-free, we hope more consumers will do the right thing for themselves and protect themselves. And I guess the final thing I wanted to say was really our view as a major corporate in this country is that it's not about us going it alone, but actually it's about us doing it in partnership with startups. So our industry, financial services, is not the easiest to get into. Quite often you do need substantial amounts of capital. Regulation is sometimes challenging, but actually deeply, deeply important. And we are experts in that. And in addition to that, a trusted brand is still important in our industry when, at the end of the day, we have people's money. And so our approach to this is not just build our own stuff, but actually it's to invest in small businesses, and it's also to partner with businesses big and small. And we hope that approach will kind of basically ensure that we disrupt before we're disrupted, and that we win before we're beaten. And I really mean that not at the level of Aviva, but at the level of the UK as a whole, because it is a competitive world out there.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. Romilly.
Firstly, thank you very much for having me. And I think I want to focus very much on the impact of digitisation, building on what the Minister said about very much looking forward and seeing where the jobs will be created. And I think there is quite a strong need to be quite bold and bullish about the fact that increased digitisation, which leads to increased productivity, does not have to mean reduced jobs and people displacing jobs being displaced and them not being replaced. Because I run Coadec, which is a policy group for tech startups. And one of the things that struck me was when I joined, everyone would talk quite freely about, digitisation is across every single sector, and the digital economy is booming, which it is, and we are world leaders, and our potential is huge. I think it was the Minister only recently said how we're just at the foothills, and that is very exciting. But actually, when you look at digitisation across sectors, we are actually still quite far behind European leaders. Denmark is the leader, but then you see Sweden is doing very well as the US. And I think what's really interesting that could form part of the industrial strategy, indeed, I think it must form part of the industrial strategy, is where are those sectors with the greatest potential to create these new jobs through digitisation. And the sector that comes out up top, well, there's two sectors, is healthcare and professional services. And I think healthcare is particularly interesting because you're seeing great disruption. A number of new startups have entered the space, very much focused on basically being able to have a doctor come to your home. There's one called Push Doctor, Babylon, but there's lots more entering this market whereby people can have greater access to doctors and to the NHS, but they don't need to go through the whole system. But when people are looking at healthcare, if we matched the digitisation rates of Denmark, it was found that we would create 72,000 new jobs in healthcare. And I think people always think, but where do these jobs come from? And I think it's really exciting to think, well, actually, when you look at the startups that are entering the space, they are creating jobs. People need to do those jobs. And actually, even doctors are being freed up to be more productive and more effective. And I think going back to the productivity debate that is going on, I think we need to, again, be quite bold about the productivity. Labour productivity is increased through increased digitisation. And it's a place where the UK could really be a world leader. But I do think it needs to be completely integral to the industrial strategy. And I know one of the questions is very much about incumbents, and actually it's looking at how the incumbent can work with new emerging technologies and our startups to great effect. And just touching on from the angle of Aviva, who I know is doing some brilliant work with Founders Forum, I think the role of corporates is also really exciting. It doesn't always have to come from government and investment support and strategies. Actually, there's huge potential for corporates to work better with startups and break down some of the barriers that we see through the approach to investment, which can be quite difficult for startups. But I won't go on too much because I feel, that's that's what I would
Well, that's extremely helpful. And also, you have reminded me to remind you that we've got some extremely interesting policy exchange documents at the back. This one is on industrial strategy. It's actually a good read if you're interested in these kind of things. And I often find myself genuinely turning to look things up and remind myself of things that are in it. And they're at the back, and you're very welcome to actually take them. Alistair Cohen, I think, is actually working in an area which is very interesting. We've all talked about using technology in helping people at home who need care in difficult social circumstances. We've had the community alarms for many years, but this is really, I think, talking about taking it to a new stage that we've really not, in any practical sense, made a fist off before. Is that right?
Yeah. Community alarms are actually an interesting one to bring up. So OnCare, we are a technology platform for social care. Our main aim is to try and get care workers doing less paperwork and actually spending time with their clients and delivering care, because that's what they want to do and that's what they're being paid to do as well. I was with some carers recently, and one of the things they had to do on the piece of paper was to write down whether the client had access to the emergency alarm. The client had no mental capacity at all. She had later stage dementia. So the fact that they had to write down, yes, she had access to the alarm, even though she wasn't actually able to use it or wouldn't have been using it, just kind of shows how some of the older technologies are not working for the people that actually need them. So we are a business that's spun out of Founders Factory Incubator, which Aviva are invested in. So we are one of the examples of how a big corporate can work with a technology incubator to create something that actually solves problems for real people. And what we do is we have an app that care workers can use to report on their visits. They can mark off things really quickly that they actually did. They can leave notes that actually mean something to people when they write the notes down. Families get a text message to say that the care worker has arrived or left, and then the agencies can save money by not having to collect in large volumes of paper, store them for 8 years, and pay for storage and collection and postage and all that craziness. So I suppose to the point of increased digitisation, that's our whole business. The social care sector is not one that has embraced technology particularly readily over the last few years. It's one of our challenges in trying to convince those managers of care agencies that this is not scary technology, that it's safe, it's secure, that the care workers can use it. So our target user for our app is a 65-year-old non-native English-speaking care worker, just because we want to make it super simple for everyone to be able to use, and we've relied on SMS technology to enable the families to stay involved without having to download a new app or understand how that works. So we're trying to make that super accessible. So one of our challenges is trying to convince care managers that moving from paper is okay, and then the benefits it can have in terms of saving money, and then in terms of the data that you can access to the point about trying to spot trends in helping people make the right decisions. If you can actually see what sort of patterns of behaviour lead to a hospital visit or lead to someone's health deteriorating, you can then take those models and reapply them to other people and try and course correct when someone's care is not going well, even down to the level of, did they see enough people this week? It doesn't have to be complicated. It can just be, did they have enough human contact to make them feel better this week? We are trying to, I suppose, increase digitisation within social care as part of the kind of healthcare revolution. The Babylon guys I've met a few times, and they're doing some good things in the space as well. And in terms of the job side of things, one of our missions, one of our aims is to actually try and celebrate care workers and give them a place to show off their skills and their expertise. So one of the places that I think, if there are people being dislodged from other jobs where typically humans were doing, social care is one of those things that for a long time, until a machine or a robot can learn to be caring, can do some of the practical stuff like clean people or wipe their bottoms or whatever it happens to be, there will be a need for people in the sector. And what we're trying to do is give them a place that care workers can show off their expertise and their background. There's not really a LinkedIn for care workers. A lot of care workers aren't actually on LinkedIn, even though they could be. And we want to create a place where, ideally, the ones that are great stop being paid the same as the ones who've just joined the industry, but the ones that are great get paid more. They can show off that they've delivered this number of care hours, they've got these sorts of credentials, they can be given greater pay, and then a backfill can be for the newer care workers, so there's career progression and job progression within social care, which I think is something that, as a sort of side tangent to our main business of actually trying to digitise the sector, we really want to celebrate care workers for the superheroes that they are. So that's what we're doing.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed. And I think the panel have set up the range of issues neatly in all their dimensions, and it's now very much over to you. And I'm going to take three questions. There's a gentleman straight at the back there, and a question at the front, and a question in there with a white shirt. So I got around the room.
Hello. Hi, my name's Matt. I'm from a new rail tech delay repair startup called Railguard. We're creating a new technology platform that's going to hopefully create new jobs next year. But before that, I used to work at Hiscox in York as one of the company's innovators. So my question is sort of for you, Andrew. When will I be able to buy from Aviva a health insurance policy that's linked to a wearable device that my premium will then change based on how healthy or unhealthy I'm being?
Brilliant.
So when I'm 6 beers in on an evening, I'm spending more money, but when I'm 6 apples in or being at the gym, it goes down.
Very good.
And Andrew as well, if with LiDAR now 40% of all car accidents that take place are in car parks, LiDAR is preventing that. When we get to level 4 and level 5 autonomous drive, what will be the role of motor insurance with autonomous drivers? And then do you face the threat of class actions when you have malware or data outage, which takes down entire fleets of cars? And for the Minister, it was 100 years between the Gutenberg Press and the Reformation. It was 10 years between the horse and the Model T. We're now seeing, with the sort of ubiquity of the smartphone, the penetration of the internet, open source software, and cloud-based storage, we could form a company today in this room, amongst 5 of us, that for $5,000 would be global instantly. And with the violence and the alacrity of change now, where Airbnb is the biggest hotelier in the world by some margin, where Uber has destroyed Avis and Hertz, how can we have a policy when the violence of change is already happening amongst us? And what happens to the economically meaningless that are left behind?
Very good. And next question.
Con O'Neill from Roche Diabetes Care. A sort of technical question about how we achieve scale. Romilly mentioned that healthcare has huge potential, but that the likes of Denmark are far ahead of us. For about 20 years, we've had quite strong ways in this country of if you have a good drug, of getting it to market. We know that in med tech, that's hardware at the moment, we don't have that ability. So what can we do to make sure that digital, when it's recognised as being effective, gets to people?
Lovely. Now, I'd like to suggest we work across the panel because there may be things they're interested in, got something to say or not or whatever. So if we kick off with our sponsors at that side.
Sure, yeah, let me ask a couple of things. So
you do whatever you fancy.
Matt, you'll have to watch this space as to exactly when you're going to be able to buy a health insurance policy, which the price of which modifies according to your behaviours. And I'm thinking that with your impressive physique, you might be worthy of an extremely low price private medical insurance. We're innovating in a few areas there, and I think actually in the case of health, one of the areas we're looking at specifically is in fact bringing out, shall we say, sort of more specific and less comprehensive and therefore more affordable health policies to cover specific needs and fit in more with the kind of specific needs of individuals rather than the kind of historical thing in the UK, which is basically if you want to buy private medical insurance, it's this huge high-cost product. So we're focusing on a slightly different thing. That said, we are also experimenting ourselves with sort of apps that do link into your health tracking monitors, your movement and so on. What we have learned in that area is actually there may be some individuals like yourself who are incredibly well disciplined. Most people, and I'd include myself in that group, actually find what they need is peer pressure. And where it's working really well is actually in company or corporate environments where not only do I get nudged by my app, but I also get nudged by my work friend next door to me who encourages me to go and do a bit of exercise. But really good challenge there. The gentleman here on LiDAR, and I guess road safety in general, that is being improved by semi-autonomous and ultimately autonomous vehicles. First of all, our view, one, is that that's a damn good thing. I mean, we want to have fewer accidents. And I think we are a way off levels 4 and 5 kind of autonomy, but we are already seeing, most vehicles that are coming off the production line today, as I'm sure you know, they have a lot of, should we say, assisted driving aspects to that, and we are seeing the impact of that in terms of safety, which is extremely good, we think. We do have our own Aviva Drive app, and I don't know if anyone's used it. It basically gives you feedback on the quality of your driving. It looks at the speed, your acceleration, your deceleration, and ultimately gives you a driving score. And what we've found is great about that is that, as we all know, driving is quite a social thing in that we all think we're quite good at it, particularly, and I know this is a gender stereotype that's going to come here, particularly men seem to think they're damn good at it. And what we found very amusing but deeply important from a societal point of view is that people are sharing their scores socially. So I'd like to think that I'm a better driver than my daughter and vice versa. But the important thing is actually people are using it to have serious conversations digitally about what they should do to drive more safely before they've got an entirely autonomous vehicle. In the case of Aviva, if you get a good score, by the way, the price of your insurance goes down. I do think you raise a really, really important point, though, which is that we are moving into a world where, I think we're actually moving, this is a personal comment, through a period of some slight uncertainty where there is a danger that you're not sure whether the computer or whether you is driving. I think that's something we need to be very, very mindful of. But I think we'll ultimately quite soon moving to a world where the computer is driving. And I don't think we have yet solved the problem as to how we deal about liability in that case. And I think the industry better get on and do that pretty damn fast.
Should go from personal claim
Absolutely.
to class action. So
Absolutely. No, I agree. And you know, this is obviously all engineers think they are God's gift to mankind, but in this particular case, they are being forced to make ethical choices through the coding that they make, which will basically determine what the car does when it hits that dangerous situation.
Matt, I knew you wanted to come in on that.
Yeah, so it's a very good segue into the response I wanted to give, which is that, you know, the one of the things that is changing is that previously implicit ethical decisions or automatic human decisions are becoming explicit ethical decisions. So if you're driving a car down the street and there are two people in the road, the choice currently, if you were driving, whether to change direction and knock one person down, or to hit two people through the omission of action, is an implicit one taken in the moment for which we're not really trained, and we don't have to take a view in advance. When you come to program the algorithm for an automated autonomous car, you do have to consider those sorts of dimensions, and setting out the ethical framework that on which the algorithm is based is going to be a critical part to keeping public trust, and trust is so important in this. Another example is in health insurance. We can now make the explicit decision, for instance, not to allow for gender-based decisions. In motor insurance, the European Commission said that gender is not a classification on which it is reasonable to make an insurance decision. But when it comes to sequencing an individual person's genome, how would a health insurance system work under that? Because you suddenly can't pool risk because you know too much to be able to pool the risk. Now, in the UK, fortunately, we have a whole of society risk pooling mechanism in the NHS, which helps us to deal with some of these things. But it just demonstrates the ethical questions that are going to be made explicit that currently we don't have to really think about. And this brings me to answer the first question, which was about jobs. And ultimately, the pace of change that we're experiencing now is going to be the slowest pace of change that we're going to experience for the rest of our lives. The slowest. Now, I first said that, I had that thought when I was sitting in front of, I was briefing the House of Lords on the data protection bill, and I looked at them and I said, this is going to be the slowest pace of change you experience for the rest of your lives. And then I said, well, and my life too. because I think it's going to get faster and faster. And thinking of it that way actually makes it more of a shock rather than less of a shock, right? Than just saying it's going to constantly accelerate. And so we've got to get ahead of it. And this brings us to this. It brings us again back to the jobs question. And I just wrote down this phrase. You said, what are you going to do with the economically meaningless? And I just profoundly disagree with the approach and the mindset that leads to that sort of analysis. Because because if we're going to be confident in dealing with this problem, you've got to both seize advantage of the technology, but also make sure that it works for everybody. So I am one of the Conservative Party's strongest supporters of the living wage, at the same time as being incredibly pro-tech and pro-free market. And the reason is because you've got to make sure that everybody can contribute, and everybody's contribution leads to a reasonable return and pay, and at the same time allow the technology to be harnessed, because the alternative is that we don't harness it and everything goes worse. So I think that we do have to think about this very hard, but ultimately we've got to make sure that the technology works for everybody, and I've got every confidence that we can do that.
I just wanted to pick up on that point, because I was quite struck by that, and I think absolutely there are real challenges and questions to be addressed. But at the same time, I think the importance of the individual and the consumer that now has the power through platforms such as Airbnb and indeed Uber, I think is really powerful. And I think it's, and we do have to kind of remember that the democratic role that it can play, but also picking up on the scaling point, which is such an important good point. I talk to so many startups that are working with NHS. One in particular is working with NHS Wales, and there's huge will there. But I think with any kind of process of change, I think in the UK where we are now, it says the will, but with any kind of legacy system, it takes time and behavioural kind of impact has to kind of change. And I think I'm very positive about where we are moving, but there's definitely, I think, progress to be made. At the same time, the Treasury is focused very much on patient capital review, looking at how we can kind of invest on the long-term investment pipeline rather than just early stage. And talking to international investors, I think what was really striking is they all say, you have the NHS, this big public sector kind of market that is your strength. Really, it almost kind of is the envy of the world in many respects, and how you can kind of better work with the NHS to kind of support innovation and allow startups to integrate with the legacy that is the NHS at the moment, and really advance innovations, which I think is another great potential for the country.
Alistair.
So I suppose just picking up on the kind of wearable linked to insurance policy stuff, I think is something we're seeing also in the care side of things is people. There are quite a lot of companies that are putting in bits of hardware into people's homes to kind of monitor what they're doing and try and deduce from that what's going on. They are all interested in talking to people like us, because actually the harder bit is to capture what people think and get the actual human side of things as to what actually is going on, as opposed to just put some hardware in and sort of run away and hope that you can monitor it remotely. So I think that the solutions need to be, as it probably will be with the financial sector, a mixture of some technology that can give you some data, but there will be a sort of human element to it as well. In terms of the sort of speed of policy change, it's interesting. There's the care agencies we deal with are being pushed by the regulators to deliver better care, and by the local authorities to do it with less money and in less time. So I think there's definitely some policy change needed to trickle down to kind of the local authorities, that they optimise for better quality of care, not just trying to squeeze out the times, the sort of 15-minute visits that you hear happen, where what can you achieve in 15 minutes really? And yeah, I suppose there's a difficulty there. I'd be really interested to speak to anyone who's involved in sort of social care provision in any local authorities, if there are any in the room, just to try and, because there are old antiquated systems. Also, there's a competitor of ours called CM2000, which is a system that a lot of local authorities prescribe has to be used, and the process is a care worker arrives, they ignore the client, they pick up a phone, they have to dial into a system with a code to prove they're at the person's home. they put the phone down, and then they can crack on with speaking to the person and delivering care, which is an antiquated system and something that I think by policy should not exist. It should be focused on actually dealing with the client first. So there is definitely some room for policy to catch up. And then how do we scale technology and get it to people? Biscuits is good. I found that's a really handy method. If you want to speak to people about new technology, buy them biscuits. They're much more receptive after biscuits. But there is a serious point there that actually a lot of our time is spent trying to get pilots with care agencies and with local authorities and with charities. Once we get the pilot agreed, then there's something about, well, are we okay to go out with the care workers, and do we have to sort of stay outside or go into a different room, or what else has to happen there? And there's not really a particularly useful place for med tech companies or care tech companies, which is a term I think I've just created, to pilot. And you can't, the worst thing is if we, as technologists, are creating products to be used out in the field from an office, and we never go and see it in the real world, or we never go and see it if it's something to help with operations or diagnosing patient conditions, whatever it happens to be. Without piloting and trialing, obviously with the right safeguards in place, you can't learn how to improve the product. So I suppose some push for giving startups and smaller companies the ability, again with safety considered, to go out and pilot what they have and to try and learn from, or maybe it's something mandated by the care providers or the healthcare providers, that piloting new solutions should be part of what they have to do, as opposed to something that they can opt to do.
I think we've got time for another full round of questions, but I suggest we make them crisp and sharp, and there's a question there.
Thanks very much. One thing that hasn't been mentioned by the panel yet is education. We're talking about the creation of, thousands and thousands of new jobs. We're going to need people to fill those jobs and people who are appropriately educated. For example, at my son's school, they start learning programming when they're 7 or 8 years old. I'm not sure that's the norm, but I'm certainly, I'm a big fan of that, clearly. But I do wonder, more broadly, there's obviously things that I know that are done that could be just rolled out to other people. But I do wonder whether, there's something around kind of all of these jobs that don't actually exist yet, that people don't actually know what they're going to be. How do you educate people to be able to fulfill those roles if you don't even know what the jobs are going to be yet?
Gentleman at the back now.
Brilliant, thank you. Dr. Killick, veterinary surgeon. Another question directed at Andrew, I'm afraid. But with disruptive tech moving forward, how do you see things like the blockchain and smart contracts coming into effect in the insurance world? Are we going to get to a future where, for example, to take a topical issue with the collapse of Monarch, that as soon as the system detects that your flight is cancelled or delayed beyond the time set in your insurance policy, the policy is automatically activated and the money is in your account instantaneously?
Right, one more question. Hand round.
George Deere from the think tank Policy Connect. The government quite rightly want to support disruptive innovation through the industrial strategy, but by its very nature, disruptive innovation is very difficult to predict. Yeah. Therefore, if you can't predict the innovation, it's very hard to know what the economy of the future that you want to encourage will look like. How can we know the industrial strategy is working, therefore, without being able to develop key performance indicators to actually measure it until we get there?
Very good. Now, I'm going to say to the panel, pick anything you want. You haven't got to answer all the questions. Whatever you fancy, you want to chime in on, and we'll go back. Start with Alistair this time.
I will just answer, just for speed, the education one. I'm a product manager by training. I didn't know that existed as a job a while ago, before I did it as a first job when I was at moo.com, the print design company. I would love to see there being a product management course. There is starting to be through General Assembly and some other people who work in the kind of tech sector. But as a product manager, your role is to basically put yourself in the life of someone else, understand the problems that they face, then understand what constraints you have in terms of resource, budget, and time, and then build some solution that you then loop back and tests actually solves the problems for that person that you were intending to solve. So the reason I think that's important, and I've mentioned this before, is that I feel like politics is quite a good place for that sort of role to exist. Someone who actually goes into the communities that they're trying to support, understands specific problems that people are facing, looks at the budget that they have available and the constraints, and then delivers a solution that they verify is then actually helping towards that problem. So I suppose the only thing I would like to see is one of the jobs of the future that we may not be able to predict, but definitely a course I would like to see in schools is a product management course, because I think it's applicable to a lot of other roles that will exist in the future and now.
Romilly.
Yeah, very quickly, just picking up on the skills point, I think what is quite interesting is that you can see the skills that may be needed, and we already can see where we have skills gaps, and there are great many number of startups matching the job market to skills shortages. So I think we can very much look forward to the skills that will be needed, and then kind of focus on the areas of our most strength across AI, software programming, robotics. And then I think with the risk question around the industrial strategy, I do think as a government it's kind of very important to look forward and actually want to have that kind of slight element of risk that there are unknowns, but actually if we are going to move forward and have a kind of a high stake in kind of global Britain, it's important that there is a kind of an element of risk, I think, to the way we look forward.
Thanks very much. Very quickly on the, I'm absolutely delighted that your children are learning coding in school. It's one of the best things we did when in DFE, Michael Gove put coding in the curriculum from the age of 8, so it's now in all schools. My worry is that that was 3 years ago. The kids are now going to secondary school. We've got to make sure the capability is there in the secondary school to keep them improving. But really what we need to do is ensure that they are also taught a mindset and a set of capabilities to do what sort of jobs, problem-solving jobs, and with human empathy and creativity, the things that humans are going to be able to do better than machines for a long time to come. So there is an attitude that's got to be taught, as well as the hard, the rigorous education. And this actually ties into the answer to the question about how do you measure, what are the KPIs of this economy that we don't know what it's going to look like. Well, I think firstly you've got to basically have a good stab at it, and you never know what the economy is quite going to look like in a few years' time. But what you can try to design regulations that are future-proof. You can try to design them that are technology neutral, design them in a way that you can update them, give regulators the power and sometimes the statutory requirement to support innovation, as well as do whatever protecting they need to do. And so you can structure things as well as possible, but it's inevitable that you're not going to know what the next technology is, and that's great, and it's very exciting, and we shouldn't see that as a problem. But there is one huge other issue here to do with measurement, which is that we can't even measure productivity properly anymore, because a lot of the digital innovations technically reduce GDP, even though whilst they were improving our lives, right? Some of you may have heard me use this example before, but I use City Mapper, and it means that I know that it's quicker to walk 10 minutes to the canal boat that I'm staying on rather than get a taxi. That's great. It makes me feel better. It improves my health. It improves my state of mind. It improves my real income because it reduces my costs. It cuts GDP. Therefore, it cuts productivity. And there's many, many digital innovations that improve people's lives but cut productivity, because productivity is simply measured, the stats are simply measured GDP divided by the amount of the labour force, and however measured. And there's a massive global effort on to try to improve the way that we measure the economy and productivity. But it is it's really hard to answer that question, but it's really, really important that we do.
What is interesting is the government's digital economy.
By saying what is interesting, you're replying to my...
No. He's going to purr in a minute. What is interesting is the government's Digital Economy Act, that as it was going through, many people saw as interesting, virtuous, helpful. When you speak to the ONS, they're quite confident it's going to enable them to transform their measurement of the economy in the sorts of ways that you would actually find very helpful indeed. And they really are up for it in a big way.
Yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah, so first of all, on the point of preparing ourselves for the knowledge economy, I mean, look, we're all going to be working in a situation where we're going to have multiple careers, multiple jobs, multiple employers, probably all at the same time. And I think there's an irony about that in my view, which is that I actually think what we need to do is to combine what some might call a classical education with the ability to retrain when we need to in specific topic areas. So actually, as the Minister said, part of what you need to succeed in today's knowledge economy is an attitudinal thing, right? It's the resilience, adaptability, curiosity, ability to be articulate. Those are actually very important if you're going to have to work in multiple areas and multiple careers. However, you combine that with specific training courses when you want to switch. So we are turning a load of actuaries into data scientists at the moment. Last week, my senior team, who hopefully do know a thing or two about digital, we all went through a cybersecurity training because you can't stand still on those things. So I can actually see a funny combo required of deep classical education with the ability to upskill, retrain throughout your career. So that's kind of thing one. And then on the blockchain point, very good point. I do think technologies such as blockchain, and it's not the only one, do absolutely have a meaningful use for us. Just to give you a concrete example, one thing that's, again, very antiquated is a thing called Know Your Customer and anti-money laundering. It's a thing where, for very, very good reasons, you need to make sure that the person in front of you digitally is the person they say they are. We work with a startup called Tradle in the FCA's own sandbox. It's a sort of safe area to play, I suppose, to test using a selfie and image recognition on your passport linked into the government's own APIs those are kind of into their own government systems to make sure that we could check in a matter of seconds rather than weeks of sending paper to each other that the right person, the person who is who they actually say they are. So I think those technologies absolutely have very, very practical uses, and absolutely automatically paying out policies is a great one. I mean, we believe our fastest payout is 9 seconds. We're in competition with another company that thinks their fastest payout is 3 seconds. And as someone whose daughter actually had a Monarch Airlines flight in a couple of weeks' time, I will look forward to see whether my Aviva travel policy pays out for that.
I think both the panel and you are doing very well in crispness. I think we'll try another 3 very crisp questions. Gentlemen there.
Hi, Robert Grant. I'm in a private capacity. I was wondering, this...
Crisp! I'm under marching orders. We're all under marching orders.
Yeah, this panel strikes me as being pretty appropriate about maybe 2.5 years ago. I was at a panel earlier today, and it did a much better job at just being kind of pro or anti-tech. I fear that this is another one of those that's just saying tech's everywhere, it's fantastic, it's huge, it's a great opportunity. Wouldn't it be interesting if we focused a little bit on how we actually encourage innovation, disruption, and new companies in the UK? And the only way we can really do that is by recognising that there's a huge amount of dominance by these enormous players who have come in, they throw a lot of money and wait around. How is it that we can encourage UK firms to set up? It really has to be government taking a bit more of an interest in the overall marketplace, and competition policy needs to be up to date.
Lady at the back there.
Cox from Westminster City Council. Airbnb, big disruptor. We have 1,300 cases of short letting that are in principle turning parts of our city from residential accommodation to badly managed hotel districts. Given what Sadiq Khan has done with Uber, do you think the big digital companies are going to be more compliant with regulators and public authorities as a result, or retreat and become more defensive?
One more. Gentleman at the front.
Data decoupling. Lee Chamberlain, London Borough of Enfield, and a programmer in web design for the last 20 odd years. Data decoupling is a big area, an opportunity for government to actually pitch in and support business, because a lot of businesses have data tied up in proprietary systems. We need to replace those proprietary systems at some point, usually with another proprietary system. So what we need, I think, is some help from government in terms of setting up standards that mean we move to technologies that don't tie us to proprietary systems, and that will create far more mobility and a more opportunities to disrupt the market.
Right, now as a panel, to get us out of here in time, we're going to have to answer these questions crisply as well. So, who wants to deal with Airbnb?
Well, can I answer both questions? Because these two questions were very similar. But I'll answer all three because I agree with you. And I get the point that you were making, which is that I am unambiguously pro-tech, as you can see. I wish that this was the sort of... You implied that this was a debate 3 years ago and now is settled. I wish it was, right? But we have this massive political argument between some people who are anti-tech and essentially anti-innovation because they want to keep the existing jobs. And so I have actually redoubled my efforts, and will do, since Corbyn's speech last week, to make the case for new technology. It is astonishing that we have to make the case for new technology. And with the increase of choice and individuality and connectivity that the digital world gives us, now is the worst time possible to have some collectivist socialist government approach. And so I wish it were okay that now we could take all this as read, but it is no longer. However, there is a point that then ties to the Airbnb point, which is that I am pro-tech, but I'm also very strongly in favour of the technology companies living within a regime that we set through democratically legitimate organisations. I gave a speech on the future of the internet last week in which I talked about how they've moved to move from essentially a libertarian approach, which is let it all hang out. You know, if it's online, that's fine, and the more we do, the better to connect people, to one based on liberal values where, yes, you support the freedom and the innovation, but within a framework that mitigates risks. And making sure you get that balance right, and the tech companies, the big tech companies in particular, live under the rule of law, that innovative companies also think about the ethical framework as well as their statutory obligations. These are incredibly important. That's what the Digital Charter, which we're doing a lot of work on, a big part of the manifesto, was all about. And Airbnb is a case in point. So I think that it was misguided of Sadiq Khan to ban Uber. I think his mistake was TfL had only met Uber once in the last year. The whole thing with the tech revolution is you've got to have much more conversation and integration. The FCA's regulatory sandbox is essentially about conversation. The idea, of course, there is a challenge from Uber, but the idea that you don't talk to them except once in a year and then you ban them and do a blanket ban is a complete failure of leadership on Sadiq Khan's part. And of course, Uber have got to obey the rules, but you've got to talk to these companies. And when it comes to Airbnb, I actually took through the bill that made Airbnb more available in Westminster. I know Westminster City Council weren't very happy about that, but the point is that what we've done there is made explicit a thing that was implicitly before you just couldn't use, before the technology, you couldn't use your asset. If you own a piece of property in central London, if you had a hotel license, you could use that asset to make money out of it. If you didn't, then you couldn't. And now we can actively choose what is the appropriate limit for people using that asset in order to let somebody else come and stay. I personally think that Airbnb is incredibly positive, force for good, allows ordinary people to use their assets, to monetize their assets, and allows ordinary punters to go and stay in the most extraordinary places like the canal boat that I mentioned, which I found on Airbnb. And yes, of course we should have a framework around it, and that framework must be enforced, but the framework should also take into account the massive positive advantages that these technologies bring.
I'm going to ask...
I'm sorry, I overran.
No, because we are going to end very firmly at past. I'm just going to ask Aviva, who's been so good at actually winding us up to take an interest in all this, in equally crisp manner, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Well, so first of all, I absolutely think that technology can be made a force for the good. And fundamentally, the key thing is let's be active and take some measured risks in our regulation to get it right rather than be hesitant. I think it's absolutely right to insist that all businesses that are playing by the rules, but let's move the rules when they're no longer fit for purpose. And we see that all over the place. And the final thing, to your point actually, about owning our data and having control of our data and allowing us much greater freedoms, I think open banking, which we are on the very eve of enjoying, is a great example of where we're about to see that. It's an experiment for all to a degree, but I think that is a very daring move in terms of giving individuals control of their data and a lot more freedom to choose who and how they deal with for those sorts of purposes.
Well, I think you've been a very good audience in asking a range of interesting and challenging questions. You've been good at being crisp as well and being chivied along. I think the panel's done us proud in teeing up the exam questions to be explored. I want to thank you all very much for being here. The question towards the end that said, well, is the panel asking the right questions and pursuing the right agenda? I'm sympathetic in this sense, that we have to have competition policies that actually help disruptors and don't protect incumbents. But we've also got to be very mindful that new technologies can create new conditions for monopoly afterwards. And it's how you actually harness technology, except on occasions that it will exploit a natural monopoly that it has created, and sometimes, of course, we help it with a patent. But that is the very real challenge. And I know a large part of President Obama's economics team, before it got disbanded in January, was spending a lot of time thinking about those kind of questions. But thank you all very much for coming to help us do this. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. Many thanks.